Hello, traveler. You're tired, and it's time to rest. We've gathered by the campfire to relax and listen to ancient stories. Grab your cup of warm drink and join us. Let this starry night completely capture our attention. In the high towers of King's Landing, where the sea murmured like an old tale against the cliffs and the banners of House Baratheon snapped in the salted wind, there lived a boy whose crown sat crooked atop his golden curls. His name was Joffrey, and he was called king by all who feared him, though few believed him fit to rule. The Red Keep, carved of blood-red stone and steeped in the breath of ancient dragons, loomed over the city like a watchful spirit. Its halls echoed with the footfalls of courtiers and spies, with laughter spun like daggers and secrets whispered behind silk-draped doors. It was a place where smiles were masks and eyes, always eyes, followed. Joffrey walked those halls like a boy wearing his father's armor, heavy with expectation and hollow beneath. To those who bowed before him, he was the Lion King, heir to Robert Baratheon, first of his name, but within the boy's heart, beneath the sharp sneer, beneath the cruel eyes that sparkled when others wept, there was a silence so deep it rang in his ears like a bell that never stopped tolling. No one heard it but him. Each night, the dreams came. They began softly, as dreams often do, like mist curling beneath a closed door. He stood alone in the great hall, where the iron throne loomed like a beast made of swords. Its edges gleamed, even in shadow. The hall was empty save for him, and the sound, a heartbeat, not his own, slow, deliberate and close, closer. In the dream, he tried to run, but the throne would not let him. Its blades coiled like roots, binding his ankles, his wrists, pulling him down into its jagged mouth. He screamed, but no voice came, only the clink of steel and the scent of blood not yet spilled. He would wake with a start, sweat cold on his brow, the dawn a mere promise beyond his window. The sheets tangled around his legs as if they too wished to hold him. "Another dream, my sweet boy?" Queen Cersei would ask, brushing back his hair, her voice soft as shadow. Her hands were always cool, always smooth, like the marble hands of a statue carved to mourn. "I'm not afraid," Joffrey would snap, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Of course you aren't," she would purr, planting a kiss upon his forehead. But in her eyes, those green, watchful eyes, there was doubt, not fear, not pity, doubt, and Joffrey saw it, felt it. The dreams would return the next night and the next. Sometimes he saw his uncle Tyrion standing beneath the throne, torchlight in his mismatched eyes. Sometimes it was his father, Robert, bellowing laughter that turned to weeping. Once, and only once, he saw a stag on fire leaping through the hall, its antlers wreathed in flame, its eyes like molten gold. It charged him, and in that moment he felt the poison stir. He never told anyone of that one. By day, the boy was king, and kings must not dream. Kings must sit tall and punish the wicked. He took delight in that, or tried to. There was a thrill to it, seeing them beg, the baker who sold sour bread, the smith who used poor iron, the boy who looked too long at the queen. He punished them all. He liked the way the crowd murmured when he raised his voice. He liked the way they fell silent when he looked their way. But the silence in his heart was louder. Once Maester Pycelle came to him with a book, thick as a boar's haunch, bound in leather and trimmed with gold. "A gift, your grace," the old man said, his beard trembling like cobwebs. "The lineages of Westerosi kings and lords, from the age of heroes to your noble house." Joffrey did not like books, but he opened it nonetheless. His fingers leafed through the pages, pausing here and there upon names he had heard whispered in the small council chamber. Lannister, Baratheon, Stark. He frowned. "So many kings," he muttered. "Indeed, your grace, and not all were wise." Joffrey looked up. "And what of me? What will they say of me?" Pycelle hesitated. "A moment too long. They will say what you command them to say, my king." But that night the dream returned, and this time the throne bled, not from its edges, but from its heart, a black, slow ooze that stained the stone and whispered his name in voices that did not belong to the living. He awoke gasping. Cersei came to him again, and this time he clutched her hand. "I don't want to dream any more. You are king," she whispered. "And kings do not dream. They command, they conquer, they endure. But the throne, it bleeds, mother, and it knows my name." Cersei stiffened, her face hardened. "You speak nonsense." But Joffrey knew it was not nonsense. Something was wrong in the Red Keep, in the wine, in the air. Something watched him, not just in sleep, but always, and still, the silence inside him grew. He ruled as kings do. He spoke sharply, he laughed coldly, he dealt punishment with a heavy hand. But the courtiers watched him not with admiration, but with careful narrowed eyes, as if he were a blade left unattended on a table, as if one wrong step might cause it to fall. He began to notice things, small things, a cupbearer who always looked away, the way the hounds barked at his door at night, the way the wine sometimes tasted faintly of copper. He accused, he punished, he raged, but the silence never left. One morning he stood before the mirror. The day was clear, the light golden, the sky blue as a summer sigh. His crown, newly polished, gleamed in the light. His reflection stared back, perfect and cruel. But behind him, just for a moment, he saw someone else in the glass. A boy with dark hair and sad eyes, wearing no crown. He turned, but no one was there. And so begins the quiet descent, the unraveling of the king with the poisoned heart. The days stretched long in the court of King's Landing, each golden hour gilded in deception. The air itself seemed thick with secrets, secrets that clung to the drapes, that coiled in the spiral staircases, that whispered down the alleyways of the mind when one was most alone. Joffrey, though young in years, felt the weight of this unseen world more keenly than most. His was not an ordinary childhood, if one could even call it that. From the moment the crown touched his brow, innocence became a currency he could no longer afford. And so, he wore cruelty as others wore armor, not because it suited him, but because he believed it necessary. Yet beneath the velvet and venom, something fragile stirred, a question without form, an ache without name. He took to walking the gardens in the stillness between sunset and stars, when the sky grew heavy with indigo and the torches had not yet been lit. The Godswood was far too quiet for a boy raised on fanfare and clamor. Its old heart tree with its pale bark and bleeding red leaves watched him with ancient, impassive eyes. He would walk past it quickly, avoiding the gaze carved into its face as though afraid it might see something even he did not yet understand. The flowers that grew here were unlike those of the outer gardens. Less tame, less ornamental, they had thorns. Their fragrance was darker, more solemn. Even the bees buzzed differently here, as if burdened with grief. He once plucked a bloom, crimson as spilt wine, and watched it wither in his palm within moments. He dropped it, and for days dreamt of red petals falling like blood. The queen, his mother, noticed the change. Cersei Lannister was not one to overlook subtlety, especially in her son. She was as brilliant as she was beautiful, her mind always several moves ahead in the game that others barely understood they were playing. But lately even she struggled to grasp the shifts in Joffrey's behavior. He was more restless, more withdrawn, less inclined to perform his cruelties before an audience. His tantrums had turned quiet, internal storms that brewed behind his eyes but rarely spilled into shouts. She feared this more than his rages. Rages she could predict, manipulate, soothe. Silence was different. Silence could not be reasoned with. "Are you well, my lion?" she asked one evening as the two of them dined alone in a chamber lit only by the soft flicker of a dozen candles. The food before them steamed gently, rich with spices from Dorne and the Reach, but Joffrey did not eat. He did not look up. "I'm fine." She studied him a moment longer, her fingers poised elegantly on the stem of her goblet. "There are whispers," she said, voice carefully even. "People notice when the king grows quiet." "I am not quiet," he said too quickly. "They should be thankful I am not angry. And yet here you are, unsmiling, untouched by feast or flame. Shall I send for the fool to dance for you? Or perhaps a hunt would lift your spirits." Joffrey's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment something like pleading passed across them, but it vanished, quickly replaced by disdain. "You don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I understand more than you think," Cersei said, her voice low, edged with both tenderness and warning. "I bore you into this world, Joffrey. I gave you life. I made you king. Whatever haunts you, tell me. Let me silence it." He stood then, too quickly, the chair scraping sharply against the floor. The candles flickered, shadows stretching long across the stone. "It cannot be silenced," he said. "It's inside me." And with that he left her, robes trailing behind him like a storm withdrawing. In the days that followed, he became a ghost in his own court. He sat the throne like a statue, still, pale, and unmoving save for the occasional flicker of his hand, the cold flick of his eyes. His voice lost its edge, taking on a dreamlike cadence, as though he were speaking from underwater. He issued strange decrees, that all mirrors be covered, that bells no longer toll for the hour, that ravens bearing ill news be burned before their messages were read. The court complied, though unease grew like mold in the corners of the keep. The king was changing, and not in a way anyone understood. In his chambers, Joffrey began keeping a journal, a habit suggested by Pycelle, who believed it would help order the mind. The boy took to it obsessively. Page after page, his thoughts spilled in erratic, looping script. But the words were less the observations of a young ruler, and more the ramblings of someone slowly losing his tether. He wrote of shadows that moved when he blinked, of voices he heard in the crackle of the hearth, of a taste in his mouth, metallic and bitter, that no wine could wash away. Most often he wrote of the dreams. In one he stood upon a beach of bones. The sea had turned black, and the sky wept ash. A lion roared in the distance, wounded and furious, while a stag with a broken antler limped into the waves. He walked alone barefoot until he found a crown buried in the sand. When he touched it, his fingers bled, and then the sea spoke in 1,000 voices, each calling him by a different name, none of them Joffrey. In another, he was back in the great hall, only this time he was not on the throne. He was beneath it, crushed by its weight, unable to move. Above him sat a girl with silver hair and violet eyes, and a boy with dark curls and a wolf at his side. They spoke not to him but over him, as if he were no more than dust. He screamed, but again no voice came, only the sound of weeping steel. He began to fear sleep, and with fear came fury. He lashed out at servants, banished his maester, threatened the septa who dared pray too loudly in the sept. Even Sir Meryn, who had once been his silent sentinel, was not spared a scalding word. Only Cersei remained near, and even she was met with coldness, her presence more tolerated than welcome. She did not recognize the boy before her, not truly. This was not her golden lion cub, her darling, her destined king. This was a stranger in her son's skin. And still the silence in Joffrey's heart swelled, until it pressed against his ribs like an iron vice. One night, in a fit of restless desperation, he climbed the highest tower of the Red Keep. The wind howled around him, salt and storm in its breath. He stood at the edge, peering down into the abyss. The city stretched below, vast and blinking with torchlight. Somewhere laughter echoed. Somewhere a woman sang a lullaby. He envied her, whoever she was. Her world, small and full of love, seemed a universe apart from the cold vastness he now inhabited. He did not jump, but he did scream. One long, ragged cry, torn from the very marrow of his soul. A scream not of rage, but of fear. Of a boy who no longer knew if he was real. And the wind mercifully carried it away. In the moon-drenched solitude of his tower chamber, Joffrey sat motionless by the hearth, its flames flickering low like a dying heartbeat. His hands, which once reached for scepters and swords, now curled into fists so tightly that crescents of blood lined his palms from the pressure of his nails. Shadows danced along the stone walls, tall, twitching figures that moved without sound, and Joffrey, once ruler of men, now ruled only silent. It was not the silence of peace, nor the kind that lingers after revelry. This was the silence of something waiting, watching, listening. It clung to him like a second skin, cold and breathing. He would sit for hours like that, his thoughts tangled and formless, only to rise with a start as if awoken from a nightmare that never truly ended. The dreams had grown more vivid, no longer confined to the safety of sleep. They bled into waking hours, creeping like ivy into the crumbling masonry of his mind. In the mirror, his reflection began to change, not in obvious ways, not at first. A twitch too long at the corner of his mouth, eyes that gleamed like wet coins, reflecting things not visible to the room behind him. Once he saw a crack crawl down the glass as if the mirror itself could no longer bear to show him what he had become. He shattered it with the heel of his hand and refused to have it replaced. Now, when he dressed, he did so in the company of ghosts, the judgment of his own visage replaced by memory, by half-seen figures at the edge of his vision who said nothing, but whose presence pressed against his chest like stone. It was during one of these haunted evenings, when even the fire dared not speak too loudly, that he first heard the voice clearly. Not imagined, not dreamed, but real. It did not come from the door nor from the shadows, but from within, curling like smoke through the hollows of his bones. It was a voice without tone or accent, neither male nor female, but ancient and unmistakably knowing. It spoke his name, not the way his mother did, nor the way the people cried it in feigned celebration. It spoke it as though it were a question, as though asking if he remembered who he truly was. Joffrey. The sound made him rise abruptly, spinning in place, eyes wide and wild. He reached for his sword, though he knew it would do no good against whispers. His breath came short, and his heart pounded not with rage, but with something far more foreign to him, humility. Or perhaps it was fear masquerading as something nobler. "You are not what they made you," the voice continued, each word a dagger wrapped in silk. "You were a child before the crown, before the lies. Do you remember the sound of truth?" He shook his head violently, hands clutching at his temples, as if he might tear the voice from his skull. "Be silent," he snarled, though his voice was brittle, like thin ice over deep water. "You are nothing." "I am the part of you they buried," came the reply, soft and echoing, as though spoken down a well that had no bottom. The part that watched, the part that felt, the part that wondered. "No," he said, louder now, stumbling backwards into a table, sending a goblet of wine tumbling to the floor. It shattered, and the red spilled across the stone like a wound opening, like a secret made visible. "I am king. I am the lion. I am." "You are a boy," the voice said, final and unyielding. "And you are poisoned." Joffrey collapsed then, breath heaving, sweat beading across his brow. He did not cry. He could not, for that too had been taught out of him. But he felt something unravel in that moment, a single thread pulled from a tapestry woven too tightly. He remained on the floor until dawn, unmoving, eyes wide and unfocused, as though waiting for the sun to offer some absolution. It did not. The morning light brought no comfort. It only cast the long shadows of the night into sharper relief. The days that followed became a parade of pretense. He sat the throne, nodded at council, dismissed peasants with a wave, and bantered with his betrothed Marjorie Tyrell with a smile that never reached his eyes. She noticed, of course. Marjorie was too clever not to. There was a kindness in her that unnerved him, a gentleness that mirrored the voice in his head far too closely. She offered warmth, and he recoiled, as though it burned. One evening, she touched his cheek lightly and asked, "What is it that troubles you, my king?" He stared at her, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, the golden flecks in them dulled to ash. "The crown," he said, voice hoarse, "weighs heavier than you imagine." She held his gaze, and for a heartbeat he believed she might have understood him. But then she smiled, not out of cruelty, but out of a desire to reassure, and that, somehow, made it worse. He turned away before the trembling in his hands could be seen. That night, the voice returned, and this time it brought visions. He saw a banquet, glittering, golden, full of light. Laughter rang out like silver bells, and courtiers drank deep from goblets overflowing with wine so red it glowed. He saw his mother across the room, watching with eyes that glistened, not with pride but with regret. He saw Marjorie beside him, radiant, though her smile was edged with sadness. He looked down at his own hands, and they were stained crimson, not from war, not from execution, but from within. His veins glowed, thin and bright, like cracks in the shell of a dying star. And then silence again, but not the comforting kind that allows for sleep. This silence was a verdict. The next morning, Pycelle was found in the rookery with a scroll in hand, a scroll addressed to the king but never delivered. The old man was dead, his mouth twisted in surprise, his fingers curled around a raven's feather. Joffrey saw the body, eyes wide with something almost akin to recognition, as if this was a piece in a puzzle only he could see. He said nothing. Instead, he returned to his chamber, closed the heavy doors, and stood before the unlit hearth. For a long moment he simply stood, breathing, listening, waiting. Then, with careful hands, he reached into the folds of his robes and retrieved the object he had taken from the rookery, a vial, small and etched with runes so faint they could only be seen in shadow. The voice was silent now, but he knew it watched, and the poison, whether of the heart or the cup, had already begun to flow. The castle bustled with a peculiar kind of energy in the days that followed, a strained, artificial joy that clung to the walls like garlands woven from brittle leaves. Spring had arrived in the capital, or so the small folk were told, though the warmth that should have accompanied it never seemed to truly settle. The Red Keep bloomed with flowers imported at great cost, their fragrance mingling with the scent of roasted meats and perfumed silks. Musicians practiced in hidden alcoves, noblemen rehearsed toasts they hoped would gain them favor, and servants scurried beneath the weight of tapestries and casks of wine, each tasked with assembling the grandest feast seen since King Robert's first tourney. For on this day the boy king would dine in honor of his union with the Tyrells, a celebration of alliance, legacy, and the crown's enduring power. But beneath the pageantry, like wrought beneath a golden mask, the court pulsed with tension. Whispers slid between fingers like coins, and not all toasts were raised with goodwill. Something unseen pressed against the edges of every corridor. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Joffrey watched it unfold from behind the veil of his own silence, seated on his high-backed throne carved with barbs and lions' heads. He wore his wedding cloak like a shroud, heavy with crimson embroidery and golden stags galloping across the fabric. His crown sat too perfectly upon his curls, a circlet of golden antlers, sharp enough to wound. He smiled, yes, he laughed, he drank. He made cruel jests at the expense of those too meek or too powerless to respond, but none of it touched the hollow at his core. His every word was a performance, each gesture a smokescreen. The voice that had haunted him in the dark was quiet now, but not gone. It lingered just beneath the surface, no longer needing to speak aloud. It had become a part of him, a whisper in his blood, a murmur in his breath. The silence no longer frightened him. It had become familiar, like the sea to the drowning. At the heart of the feast, beneath the glinting chandeliers and sprawling feast tables, Marguerite Tyrell sat beside him, radiant and poised, her eyes flickering with 1,000 meanings. She laughed with the grace of one born to this life, though even she could not mask entirely the tension that coiled within her. She had tried to love him in her way, or at the very least she had tried to tame him, to steer the ship of his madness toward calmer waters with soft words and sweeter offering. But Joffrey was not a vessel one could command. He was the storm itself, and storms do not bend to kindness. He leaned toward her, a goblet in hand, eyes glittering with something unreadable. "Smile, my queen," he said, his voice smooth but hollow. "Today the realm rejoices." She smiled, and in that smile was the wisdom of 10 generations of schemers. "Of course, Your Grace," she murmured, "though one wonders what the realm rejoices for. Love or survival?" He raised his goblet as if in salute, though his eyes did not leave hers. "Why not both?" And then the performance resumed. Music filled the hall, rich and rising like the tide. Performers juggled, acrobats twisted through the air, and dwarves in absurd costumes reenacted the War of the 5 Kings to great amusement and greater discomfort. The laughter came easy to some, forced to others. But Joffrey laughed hardest of all, sharp and wild like metal striking metal. He flung coins at the players and scorn at his uncle Tyrion, whose silence grew heavier with each jest. Wine flowed like a river, crimson and fragrant, poured into goblets shaped like lions' heads and overflowing onto silken table runners. And all the while, Joffrey drank. He drank as if the goblet might fill the emptiness he could not name, as if the taste of shadowed grapes and spice could drown the echo that followed him, as if the laughter that rang around him might chase away the truth whispered by his own blood. But it did not. It never had. And then, as the musicians struck a triumphant chord and the jesters bowed in exaggerated fashion, Joffrey rose. He raised his cup high, golden in the firelight, and silence fell across the hall like a curtain. For a breath, all watched him, some with hope, others with dread, and a few with something darker. His voice, when it came, was steady, theatrical, but edged with something that did not belong in joy. "To House Tyrell," he declared, "who give to the realm not only their bounty of harvests, but their most precious bloom." He turned, smiling toward Marjorie. "My queen." Polite applause followed, and Joffrey drank deeply, draining the goblet in a single motion. The room cheered. He set the cup down with a flourish, lips stained faintly with red. His smile widened, and then it faltered. It was subtle at first, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, a flicker of something behind his eyes. He lifted his hand to his throat, touched it as though puzzled. His breath caught, then came again, sharper this time, shallower. The hall continued its revelry, unaware. Marguerite leaned forward, a question on her lips. Joffrey staggered. The goblet tipped from the table, striking the floor with a hollow clang. Wine pooled like blood. And then came the sound, the gasp, the choke, the dry heave that silenced the hall. Joffrey clutched at his neck, his face contorting in pain and disbelief. He opened his mouth, but no words came, only a strangled cry, gurgling and raw. He collapsed, thrashing, clawing at the table, knocking dishes to the floor in a cacophony of chaos. The feast unraveled into panic. Nobles rose screaming, servants dropped trays, musicians fled. Cersei was already running before he hit the floor, her red skirts a blur. She knelt beside him, cradling his body as he writhed. "Joffrey," she cried over and over, her voice breaking, shattering, trying to reach him through the haze. "My son." But his eyes were wild now, bulging, his lips darkening to a shade that had no place in life. His fingers clawed at the stone, at her hands, at his own skin. And in the final seconds, as the poison reached his heart and the spasms ceased, Joffrey looked up, not at his mother, nor his bride, nor the faces crowding around him. He looked beyond them, past the vaulted ceiling, past the torches and the glass, into a space unseen. And in that moment there was no cruelty in his eyes, no pride, no rage, only fear, and perhaps, though none could say for certain, recognition. Then his body stilled, and the silence returned once more. But it was not the same silence as before. This silence was complete. This silence was final, and far above the towers of the Red Keep, in the sky that had watched kings rise and fall for 1,000 years, the first stars began to blink open, cold, distant, and untroubled by the grief of mortals. The throne room, once alive with gold thread splendor and the brittle laughter of lords, stood as if stunned in the aftershock of death. What had begun as a day of celebration, of alliance, cemented in blood and wine, had unraveled into silence so profound it seemed to echo louder than any war cry. The torches still burned, their flames casting halos of light that flickered against the stone pillars, but their warmth did not reach the people gathered there. Servants trembled in corners, noblemen whispered behind gloved hands, and the musicians, those poor fools with trembling fingers and pale faces, had abandoned their instruments mid-note. And there, at the heart of it all, lay the body of a boy king, pale as moonlight, mouth parted in eternal surprise, lips darkened by the final sip of poisoned wine. Cersei Lannister knelt beside him still, her red gown pooling around her like spilled blood, her golden hair disheveled, her face locked in a mask of agony that no courtly decorum could contain. Her hands clung to his tunic as if to anchor him in place, to prevent the soul she had brought into the world from slipping past her fingers. She screamed his name, not like a queen, not like a lioness in fury, but like a mother. Her voice cracked, raw and unrecognizable, a sound torn from the very marrow of grief. Guards came to her, hesitating like men unsure whether to stop a queen or comfort a woman. When they touched her shoulder, she turned on them with eyes alight, not with madness, but something far more dangerous. "Tyrion," she rasped, her gaze fixing on the small man who stood still as stone, half a step away from the fallen goblet. "He did this." The words, though few, held the power of a sword drawn in a quiet room. All heads turned. Tyrion Lannister, once jester, once hand, once the quiet conscience of the court, now became its villain in a breath. He did not flinch beneath the weight of their eyes. He did not run. He looked at the boy, his nephew, his tormentor, the boy whose small cruelties had stacked like bricks in the building of a tower from which there was no escape, and his face held not glee nor relief, but something far more subtle, pity, perhaps even sorrow. But the moment was already lost to the tides of rage. Cersei rose like a storm. "Seize him," she commanded, her voice iron. "Seize him!" And so they did. Tyrion did not resist. The guards closed in with practiced haste, their grips tight on his arms, as though afraid he might vanish like mist. He turned his gaze upward toward the throne, a thing of twisted steel and broken blades, and let his breath out slowly. "So ends the reign of Joffrey Baratheon," he whispered, too softly for any to hear, "a crown bought in lies and paid for in silence." The feast was abandoned. The guests dispersed, some in weeping horror, others in quiet, calculated retreat. Only a few remained, those too frozen to flee or too fascinated to turn away. Sansa Stark vanished, her eyes wide with terror, her body like a shadow as she slipped into the arms of those who still remembered the name Winterfell. Grand Maester Pycelle babbled incantations that no longer held meaning, his trembling fingers fumbling for files that could not reverse what had been done. Marjorie, queen in title and mourning in practice, stood alone amidst the ruin of her marriage, the very air around her laced with the bitter perfume of spoiled celebration. She did not cry, but her eyes shone, not with sorrow, but with something colder, determination. Her house had wed itself to a corpse, and she, the survivor, must now play a different game entirely. Outside the Red Keep, the bells of the Sept began to toll, low and mournful, as if the city itself groaned in sympathy. Word spread like wildfire through the alleys and markets, through the brothels and septs. The king is dead. The boy with the golden crown struck down at his own feast. Some said it was justice. Others called it treason. Many simply watched the sky, waiting for dragons or demons to descend, as always they had when kings were taken before their time. In her private chambers, Cersei sat alone, the wine untouched, the mirror covered. Her hands, still stained from Joffrey's final moments, trembled with an emptiness that no vengeance could fill. She had given everything to make him king, her dignity, her marriage, her peace. She had lied for him, killed for him, twisted the truth of his blood into a legend that half the realm now believed. And yet, he was gone, slain not in battle, not in exile, not in some grand tragedy of fate, but in a moment as cruel and senseless as any of his own petty torments. Poisoned, humiliated, a boy brought low before the eyes of a court that had only ever pretended to love him. She stood, slowly, her reflection hidden behind velvet drapes. "They will pay," she said to the silence. "Every one of them. I will peel back the world to find the one who did this." But in the corners of the room where the light did not reach, the silence did not agree. It offered her no comfort, no answers, only the echo of a child's final gasp, and a memory of a boy who had once clutched her hand in the darkness, trembling not from dreams, but from a truth he could not name. Her lion cub, she had called him, her king. But now he was something else, a whisper, a caution, a name that history would not sing in songs, but speak in hushed tones. Far below the city, In the black cells where no stars dared shine, Tyrion sat in chains. His cell was cold, but not as cold as the silence. He leaned his head against the stone and closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in reflection. The boy was dead. The game had shifted, and somewhere, someone had spilled poison, not just into a cup, but into the heart of the realm itself. And in the Red Keep, the Iron Throne waited, silent, sharp, patient. The game was not over. It had only begun again. The corridors of the Red Keep, once pulsing with the relentless rhythm of royal life, moved more slowly now, as if each step upon its stone floors echoed with the memory of the Boy King's final breath. Servants whispered in corners and moved like wraiths from shadow to shadow, afraid that even their footfalls might awaken a wrathful ghost. The walls seemed to breathe in mourning. Tapestries fluttered without breeze, and chandeliers trembled in still air. But perhaps the castle was not grieving the loss of its monarch at all. Perhaps it was merely adjusting, as it had for centuries, to the new shape of power, to the shifting of masks and the fresh weight of names whispered behind sealed doors. For though Joffrey was dead, the wake of his life, like poison poured into a river, still drifted downstream, staining all who drank from it. In the days following the feast, Cersei became a storm in silk. She did not weep publicly again after that night in the throne room. The Queen Regent, though robbed of her child and her certainty, refused to stagger. Grief for her became weaponized, a blade honed on the whetstone of rage. She summoned the council, the guards, the alchemists, and the spy masters. Her voice, once sultry and tempered, now rang sharp and cutting through the halls of power, like the clang of unsheathed steel. She demanded answers, demanded blood, demanded that the world bend to her pain. The wine she once drank for pleasure she now used to temper her fury, just enough to soften the tremble in her hands, never enough to dull her ambition. Yet beneath her fire and frost she was not blind. She knew the court watched her with wary eyes, that the lords and ladies who had once sought her favor now shifted their weight toward Marjorie and the Tyrells, toward Tommen and the promise of a gentler rule. Even Grand Maester Pycelle, who had served as her creature for years, seemed to weigh each word more carefully now, as if calculating a future that no longer had her at its center. And Varys, soft-footed and softer-spoken, floated through the corridors like a breeze carrying the scent of foreign winds, eyes unblinking, hands ever folded, waiting. Cersei hated waiting. She had waited too long already. Waited while Joffrey was twisted into something unrecognizable, waited while whispers gathered like flies on a corpse, waited for a future that had been stolen in a single, silent sip of wine. But the past... the past was a tapestry she still held the threads to, and in her solitude she unraveled it with care. In the quiet hours, when the court slept and the moon traced ghostly fingers across her chamber walls, Cersei would return to moments long buried. She would close her eyes and see Joffrey as he had once been, not a tyrant, not a king, but a boy with golden curls who clutched at her skirts and asked whether dragons ever truly slept. She remembered the first time he sat upon the lion-shaped chair his grandfather had commissioned for him, the way he kicked his small legs and declared with absolute sincerity that he would be the bravest king in the world. She remembered brushing his hair as he sulked after Sir Jaime scolded him, remembered the heat of his hand when he clung to her at night, frightened not of dreams, but of what he might become. And yet, even then, even in those earliest years, there had been something beneath the surface, a hardness, like frost beneath new snow. He did not laugh as easily as Tommen. He did not weep like Marcella. His silences were deeper, his angers longer lived. Once, at the age of 6, he struck a stable boy with a riding crop for not saddling his horse swiftly enough. Cersei had dismissed it at the time, told herself that kings must learn to command obedience. But now, the memory clawed at her, a slow, burning shame she could not cast off. Had she raised a monster? Or had she merely protected one long enough for the world to see it? These were the thoughts that plagued her, more than Tyrion, more than the poisoned cup, more even than the looming question of succession. For in the secret chamber of her mind, the truth gnawed like rats in the dark. Joffrey had not been born cruel. No one is. He had been made by whispers, made by secrets, made by fear, and most of all, made by her. She had taught him that power was not given, but taken, that kindness was weakness, that the world would never love him, so he must make it obey. She had wrapped him in silk and steel, whispered to him of his destiny, of his blood, of the lies others would tell him to steal what was rightfully his. She had raised him on vengeance and pride, not on mercy, and he had learned those lessons well, too well. His cruelty had become a mirror of her protection, his arrogance a shadow of her own. Now he was gone, and the mirror remained. Elsewhere in the keep, others too remembered. Sansa Stark, hidden in the safety of Baelish's schemes, dreamt often of that final feast. Not with joy, for she took no pleasure in the death of a boy, no matter how cruel he had been, but the image of his hands at his throat, his eyes wide and grasping, visited her in sleep nonetheless, not for vengeance, but for the question it left behind. Who had taken the choice from her? Who had decided justice should come in the form of a poisoned chalice, without her voice, without her hand? And what did it mean that she had felt no sorrow in the moment, only relief so vast it made her weep? Even the small folk spoke his name in the alleys now, not with hatred, not with grief, but with caution. Joffrey had become a warning. Don't talk back, mothers told their children, or Joffrey will rise and take you to court. The tale spread quickly, that he had died laughing, that his ghost haunted the kitchens, cursing spoiled meat, that a witch from the east had cursed him, that the wine had turned to fire in his throat because the gods themselves had deemed his soul too heavy with sin. In the end, it did not matter what was true, only that his name now carried the weight of a story already slipping from history and into myth. And so he faded, not forgotten, not yet, but fading nonetheless. As the dust settled over the Red Keep and the court rearranged itself like bones after a collapse, a strange stillness descended. It was not peace, no, never peace, but a kind of pause, a breath taken before the next scream. The Iron Throne sat cold and empty, its edges gleaming in the light of a storm-heavy sky. It waited, as it always had, for the next soul bold or foolish enough to bleed upon its blade. And somewhere far below, in the vaults where the dead sleep and the living dare not speak too loudly, the silence endured. For silence, once swallowed, does not leave easily. It becomes part of you. And Joffrey's silence, his poison, had only just begun to seep. The Red Keep in its ancient and brooding majesty had always housed the echoes of kings long dead. Their ambitions, regrets, and victories still clung to its stone like ivy, winding their way through the mortar and the memories of those who walked its corridors. Yet none of those echoes felt as immediate, as oppressive, as the one Joffrey Baratheon left behind. His ghost did not rise from the crypts with rattling chains, nor whisper through the weeping chambers in the dead of night. No, his specter was far more insidious. It lived in glances exchanged over goblets at court, in the trembling hands of the servants pouring wine, in the sudden hush that fell whenever someone uttered his name aloud. It lived in the way no one looked too long at the throne now, as if it might recognize them, as if it might remember who had smiled at his cruelty and who had dared to flinch. For Tommen, the youngest of Cersei's brood, the shadow of his brother fell like a shroud of smoke, colorless and cloying, impossible to grasp and harder still to escape. He had watched the poison work its way through Joffrey's veins, had seen the regal facade collapse into helpless terror, had heard the last breath struggle to flee a mouth that had once commanded executions with a smirk, and in that moment something in Tommen had cracked. Not visibly, not in the way that draws attention, but deep within, where the roots of childhood had not yet been scorched by power. He mourned not the king but the brother who had rarely been kind, but who had once shared his toys, who had once held his hand when their father's roars shook the tower walls. Now Tommen's footsteps were softer, his words measured, and his eyes always flickered toward the cup before he drank. Marjorie, too, bore the weight of that legacy. Her wedding night had ended in chaos, not consummation. She had been promised a crown, but now wore a veil of widowhood instead. The court watched her with fascination, wondering whether she would weep or seize power, whether she would mourn sincerely or reframe her loss into an advantage. And Marjorie, trained from birth in the quiet warfare of smiles and silences, did both. She cried at the right moments, spoke with gentleness when addressed, and wore colors of modest grief. But her eyes, oh, her eyes, never lost their brightness. She had danced with monsters before, and though Joffrey had been a harder partner than most, she had survived. And survival was its own kind of victory. But perhaps the most haunted was Cersei, though she would never admit it. Her pride was ironclad, her will tempered in fire, and her grief, though sharp, was swiftly forged into a weapon. Yet when she walked the halls where Joffrey had once held court, when she passed the nursery where he had first learned to speak, when she stood upon the balcony where he had declared himself king to a cheering crowd, she felt the absence like a wound reopening. The memory of his smile, sharp as a blade, now cut her in new ways. She had made him, shaped him, fueled him, and in the end she had lost him, not in battle, not to some noble death worthy of songs, but to a goblet and a whisper, and a moment no one could undo. She dreamed of him sometimes, not as he had died, but as he had been in her arms as a child, his chubby hands reaching up toward her, his golden hair catching the sunlight like threads of fire. In those dreams he never spoke. He only looked at her with wide, unknowing eyes, as if waiting to be told who he was, and each time she awoke with a scream lodged in her throat, a scream she refused to voice. Her chambers remained dark, even during the day. Mirrors were shrouded, candles burned low, their flames flickering with restless hunger. Silence, once her ally, had turned traitor. Now it whispered of failure. In the city below, the people whispered too. They told stories of Joffrey's death that grew stranger with each retelling. Some said a sorceress had cursed the crown for spilling innocent blood. Others believed that the wine had been poisoned by a nobleman's ghost, one slain by the Mad King and returned for revenge. The cobblers and cooks, the smiths and singers, all had their versions, and in each, Joffrey became less boy, more fable. A tyrant child turned cautionary tale. The baker warned children not to lie, lest they choke like the king. The street performers mimicked his death with exaggerated flails, earning gasps and laughter in equal measure. Already, his memory was becoming less history and more shadow. The truth, whatever it might have been, drowned in a sea of spectacle. But within the walls of the Red Keep, one truth endured with harrowing clarity. Joffrey's reign had not ended with his death. It had changed form. Like venom in the blood, it lingered. His policies, his cruelties, the culture of fear he had nurtured, had left their imprint on the court's heart. Those who had thrived in his orbit found themselves adrift, unsure of their standing under Tommen's gentler rule. Those who had suffered in silence now struggled to trust the calm that followed the storm. And through it all, the Iron Throne remained, a relic and a promise, forged not of symbols but of swords, each one a reminder that power, once claimed, is never truly surrendered without cost. One afternoon, as spring struggled to bloom across the blackened stone courtyards, Tommen approached the throne with careful steps. He was alone, save for Sir Meryn, who stood like a shadow in polished armor. The boy reached out and touched the cold steel of the armrest. It did not bite him. It did not move, but it did not welcome him either. He stared at it for a long time, then turned to the empty hall, his voice quiet. "Does it remember?" he asked. Sir Meryn did not respond. Tommen did not expect him to, for the throne remembered all. And though Joffrey's body lay buried beneath stone, and his name spoken only in whispers, the blood that had spilled from his lips still stained the soul of the realm. And the realm, though breathing, was far from healed. The bells rang slow and low through King's Landing, their sound thick with the iron taste of judgment, not the bright clamor of weddings, nor the desperate cacophony of war. This was the toll of reckoning, of a city bracing itself for the theater of truth and vengeance, dressed in crimson silk and black fur. Word of Tyrion Lannister's trial had spread through the capital like wildfire, carried on gossiping wind. Inns filled with murmurs, brothels echoed with speculation, and even the sept of Baelor found its prayers tinged with curiosity rather than reverence. The dwarf who had once ruled his hand, the imp who had saved the city from Stannis' fire, now stood accused of regicide. The people were not certain if they hated him or owed him, but they all agreed on one thing. They wanted to see him speak. The throne room had been transformed into a crucible of scrutiny. The pillars seemed taller, the windows narrower, as if the very architecture had drawn breath and was holding it. Red banners hung heavy from the rafters, their lions watching like mute sentinels. At the center stood the throne, cold and sharp as ever, behind which Tommen was not yet permitted to sit. Instead, Lord Tywin sat in judgment, the hand more visible than the crown, flanked by men who wore their armor like masks and women who veiled their intentions behind layers of courtly courtesy. Beside him, Cersei's gaze burned with unrelenting fire, every flick of her eye a knife unsheathed. She did not mourn now. She hunted. Tyrion entered the hall in chains, but his spine remained straight, his stride unfaltering. The man who had once played the fool to mask his mind, who had smiled through slurs and wounds, now wore no disguise. His eyes, once flickering with wine-soaked wit, now held a depth sharpened by betrayal. He scanned the crowd and found not friends, not allies, but actors in a pageant already rehearsed. Varys sat with his hands folded like silk, his expression unreadable. Pycelle twitched like a half-dead raven, rehearsing lies behind yellowed teeth. And Shay, oh, Shay. Her absence was a scream he had heard long before this day, a silence that had cut more deeply than any blade. In this theater there would be no justice, only roles to be played until the final curtain fell. The trial began, as all such things do, with words meant to resemble truth. Witnesses were summoned, their oaths binding in law but not in spirit. They spoke of Tyrion's quarrels with Joffrey, of the slaps, the scorn, the defiance. They quoted him out of context, reassembled his past into a mosaic of poison. He watched them with grim fascination, as one might study a wildfire approaching the gates of a wooden house. Each word was tinder, each breath a spark. Cersei did not smile, but her silence was triumphant. This was not justice. This was vengeance, served with ceremony. When it was his turn to speak, Tyrion rose slowly, his chains clinking like the bells of a jester in a darkened hall. His voice, when it came, was clear, not loud, but resonant, as if drawn from the marrow of truth itself. He did not deny his hatred for Joffrey. He did not pretend to mourn. He did not beg for mercy or offer polite regrets. Instead, he turned to the crowd and spoke not only to them, but through them, to the soul of a realm that had long since forgotten the difference between truth and performance. "I did not kill Joffrey," he said, his voice cutting the hush like a blade across velvet. "But I wish I had." Gasps rose like birds startled from a field. Tywin's face tightened. Cersei's eyes glittered with triumph. But Tyrion continued, inexorable. "I saved this city once when none of you would lift a finger. I held the gates, manned the walls, spilled blood for your survival. And yet here I stand, accused by those I protected, condemned by the lies of cowards and sycophants. You want a villain? Fine. Let me be the monster you already decided I was the moment I was born." The room fell to pieces around him, order shattered by the gravity of unfiltered rage. There was no defense after that, only reaction. Tywin, who prided himself on control, clenched the armrest of the throne as if to crush it in his palm. Cersei's lips twitched, halfway between satisfaction and loathing, and the people, the audience to this opera of venom and tragedy, leaned forward, caught not by justice but by spectacle. Tyrion was dragged away but not broken. He had delivered not a plea but a eulogy. Perhaps not for Joffrey, but for the illusion of fairness that the court pretended to uphold. His trial had never been about guilt or innocence. It was about finality, about wiping clean the smear of discomfort that a clever man brings to powerful fools. And as he was led back to the dark below, where chains rattled louder than cheers, he carried with him not fear but the bitter comfort of clarity. Far above, Cersei stood beneath the towering windows and watched the dust settle. She did not celebrate. Her son's killer, at least the one she believed bore the weight, had been cast in chains. The play had ended, yet the silence did not lift. It grew heavier. for though Tyrion's voice had been dragged away in shackles, his words lingered in the courtiers' furtive glances, in the way Tommen refused to meet her eye, on the ghost of a boy whose crown had not saved him from a death he had never truly understood. Later, in her chambers, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat beside the window, staring out at the city. The stars had risen, sharp and quiet. Somewhere a bell rang, not for justice, not for mourning, just because it always did at this hour, and in that sound she heard a question that would not leave her be. What if Tyrion was not the one? What if the poison had not come from a known enemy, but from a hand she had never noticed slipping through the folds of velvet? What if the silence Joffrey left behind was not just grief, but a warning? She closed her eyes, and for the first time in days, she dreamed. Not of vengeance, but of a cup filled with wine that no hand dared raise. It was said that truth, like smoke, always finds its way through the smallest of cracks. It may take days or years, lifetimes or lines of blood, but it will always rise, always stain the air, always reach those who thought it buried. In the aftermath of the trial, the Red Keep breathed slower, but no less heavily. The court moved on trembling legs, unsure of whether the poison had been fully purged or whether it merely slept beneath the floorboards, biding its time. Tommen had been crowned, a fragile circlet placed upon his head with the solemn weight of a crown far too large for a boy's brow. The realm rejoiced, or pretended to, for it is easier to cheer for the sun when the memory of the storm still clings to your skin. But within the keep, behind the walls where silence gathers, a question was forming, quiet, insistent, and dangerous. Who had truly placed the venom in Joffrey's cup? Not everyone forgot the shape of the chalice, nor the tremble in the boy king's final breath. Some, like Olenna Tyrell, kept their secrets locked behind smiles seasoned with age and cunning. The Queen of Thorns had played her part with masterful grace, cooing over her granddaughter, mourning with dry eyes and swift words, advising Tommen with grandmotherly affection. But behind the quips and brocade, behind the withered hand that held her cane, there was a mind sharper than any blade forged in the dark. Olenna had not reached her twilight years by placing trust in chance. She knew the cost of peace, the currency of alliances, and the poison that rotted within power untempered by wisdom. Joffrey had been a rot, dangerous, unchecked, unpredictable. His removal was not murder, it was gardening, and yet even she did not sleep easily. For murder, even righteous, leaves fingerprints in the soul. She had not acted alone. No one in the game ever did. The plan had been precise, executed during the feast with sleight of hand and a whisper's timing. The poison, the strangler, as the name whispered through apothecaries' and assassins' tongues, had been hidden in plain sight, concealed within a jewel upon a necklace worn by Sansa Stark. The poor girl, too terrified to see her own part, had unknowingly borne the tool of a king's undoing. Peter Baelish had ensured it, smiling with his serpent's lips, promising safety wrapped in silk, all the while sliding the pieces into place. He, more than any, understood that chaos was not the end of the game. It was the board upon which new kings were crowned. In the Vale, where he now kept Sansa under a different name and softer light, Littlefinger spun his web with patience. He taught her how to speak, how to smile without giving anything away, how to wear sorrow like a mask. Sansa learned quickly, too quickly. She had lived beneath lions and vipers. Now she lived beside one who offered honeyed lies with every breath, but part of her remembered the moment Joffrey had died, not with glee, not with vindication, but with a strange, hollow clarity. She had watched the blood bloom upon his lips like a flower that should never have opened. And though she had not poured the poison, had not whispered the plan nor crushed the petals that made it, the death still clung to her. In dreams she saw the goblet tip again and again, and she did nothing to stop it. And in that nothingness there was a truth she dared not yet speak. She had not wanted to stop it. Back in King's Landing, Varys moved through the halls like a shadow with purpose. He knew more than he said. He always had. While others screamed, he listened. While others accused, he observed. The trial, the execution of the plot, the balance that now hung over the city like a sword on fraying twine. It was all in his notes, in his mind, in his silence. Varys did not mourn Joffrey. He did not believe in mourning tyrants. What concerned him was what would come after. Peace was not built on noble intentions, but on careful architecture, on small, sturdy stones laid by those who understood both the weight of the past and the urgency of the future. And Joffrey, for all his crowns and titles, had been a stone best removed. The trick now was keeping the wall from crumbling further. Cersei, meanwhile, began to feel the isolation of power's illusion. Tyrion's imprisonment had not brought her closure, only questions. He had made his defiance known, but his rage did not carry the taste of guilt. It lingered instead with the weight of one who had already been condemned, not by justice, but by blood. Her dreams grew darker. In them, Joffrey did not scream. He stood at her bedside, silent, unmoving, lips dark with wine, eyes unreadable. Sometimes he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, only silence. And she woke each time with the same thought pounding in her chest like a war drum. I chose this. Her search for proof became obsessive. She interrogated servants, she questioned cooks and cellar keepers, searched gowns and jewels, sifted through every whisper that hinted at betrayal. The necklace, the cup, the timing, but no one confessed, and so, like any ruler clinging to control in a crumbling world, she chose certainty over truth. Tyrion must be guilty, he had to be. To question that was to question everything, her judgment, her power, her motherhood, and Cersei, even in grief, refused to be small. Still, the silence deepened, the silence that followed a scream, the silence left behind by a king who never knew what it meant to be loved, only obeyed. The silence of a court where no one could quite meet each other's eyes. And high above the sea, as the wind tangled itself through the battlements, the ravens watched, waiting for winter, for war, or for another cup to be raised. Time does not move forward in a place like the Red Keep. It coils, it festers, it remembers. Each stone along the battlements has known the weight of treason and prophecy, each corridor the rush of blood, the hush of secrets. And so, though the sun continued its climb and descent across the sky, though the city outside busied itself with trade and toil, within those crimson walls time had curled in upon itself, looping endlessly around a single moment. The death of a king. Joffrey's final breath, gasping and wet, had become a pivot on which the realm turned, even if it did not yet know it, and those who remained within his shadow, his family, his enemies, his silent mourners, found themselves caught not in mourning, but in transformation. Tommen's rule, gentle and uncertain, settled like a soft cloth over a cracked table. It obscured the fractures, but did not mend them. In him, the court found a quietness they mistook for peace, but peace is not the absence of war. It is the lull between its verses. The boy king was kind, too kind, his decisions always trailing the advice of others, his mother ever present and sharpening, Marjorie ever smiling and patient, the High Septon whose robes seemed to grow heavier with power each passing day. In the void left by Joffrey's roar, the realm had grown fond of whispers, of soft voices telling it what to believe, and so, while the lioness guarded her cub with claws drawn, and the rose wrapped her petals around the throne, the realm watched, unsure whether to trust this quiet or fear it. Cersei, for her part, had not truly let go. Joffrey's chambers remained untouched, his bed unmade, his books unopened, his blades and baubles untouched, as if awaiting his return from some royal errand. She visited it often, usually alone, sometimes with wine, sometimes with letters she would never send. She would sit at the edge of his bed and remember the weight of his head against her shoulder, the way he had once clutched at her hand, not in command, but in comfort. She remembered the boy before the cruelty, before the crown. And yet, even in those memories, there was always a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, something cold, curious, and deep. It had been there even in his cradle. She had told herself then it was strength, destiny, a mark of kingship. But now she was not so sure. What if it had been a cry for help? What if she had mistaken a drowning child for a rising god? But regret is not a currency that spends well in court, and Cersei had other battles to wage. Marjorie was no longer merely a girl in silks and practiced smiles. She was queen now, and with her came the full weight of House Tyrell, gold, grain, soldiers, and strategy. The small council, once her domain, now swayed with new loyalties. The small folk adored Marjorie, their good queen, who walked among them with baskets of bread and words of hope. Even Tommen, sweet and swaying, began to look toward her not only as a wife, but as a guide. And Cersei, who had bent kingdoms to her will, now found herself edged, slowly, carefully, out of the circle of power, not by decree, not by war, but by smiles and soft hands, a coup waged in laughter rather than blood. She hated it more than any sword, yet the more she clawed to retain control, the more the court began to shift against her. Varys disappeared, his birds fallen silent, his chambers abandoned. His absence was a whisper louder than any of his secrets, and into that silence crept new players, cloaked in faith and piety, led by a man whose humility masked a zeal deeper than any courtly ambition. The High Sparrow, with his bare feet and bowed head, spoke of sins and forgiveness, of kings and beggars equal before the seven. His voice was not loud, but it carried. Through the markets, through the sept, through the hearts of those who had watched Joffrey's cruelty and found in it a confirmation of corruption at every level of rule. Cersei, desperate to dismantle her enemies and reassert her dominion, thought to use the sparrow's righteousness as a blade against her foes. She did not see that it cut both ways. But the past does not fade simply because the present has changed its clothes. Joffrey's death had become a fissure, and from it old truths began to bubble. In the black cells, Tyrion's absence was noted but not spoken of. Some said he had escaped. Others believed he had been spirited away by dark magic. Few knew the truth, that he had fled the city with the help of his brother Jaime the Kingslayer, whose own eyes had grown hollow in the wake of all he had lost. The brother he had set free, the father he had killed. The line of legacy shattered like a mirror thrown to stone. Tyrion carried with him not just guilt, but a deepening clarity. He had been a man born into a kingdom of masks, and now he wandered into exile, not as a fugitive, but as a prophet of its ruin. And somewhere beyond the shores of Westeros, across the seas where dragons dreamed and broken men sought absolution, another storm brewed, one that did not yet know the name Joffrey, nor the games played beneath the Red Keep. But it would learn, for history is not bound by borders, and the poison that kills a king does not end in his blood. It lingers in the breath of every survivor. It infects the pages of every book. It darkens the dreams of every soul who once called him master. Back in the keep, the Iron Throne stood untouched for a full day. No king sat upon it, no queen approached it. The hall was empty, save for a single servant who entered to clean the flagstones, unaware of the weight of her footsteps. She paused before the throne, broom in hand, and stared at its jagged silhouette. There was something in the light that day, something strange. The steel caught it not like metal, but like glass, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw blood on its armrests, dark and drying, though none had been spilled there since the feast. She did not speak of it. She finished her work. She swept the silence into the corners and left it there. The final truth of a king does not reside in his crown, nor in the coin stamped with his likeness, nor even in the songs, whether of praise or mockery, that linger in taverns long after his bones have turned to dust. No, the truth of a king lies in what he leaves behind when the feast is over and the fire has died, in the shadows that fall across the lives of those who dared to know him, to love him. And for Joffrey Baratheon, boy king of the Seven Kingdoms, heir to 2 great houses and none of their virtues, the truth was not forged in valor or honor, but in silence. It was a silence that had begun in his cradle, when secrets were wrapped tighter than swaddling cloth. A silence cultivated through years of whispered lies and sharpened words, fed on pride, isolation, and the cold hunger of expectation. Now, that silence remained his truest legacy. Tommen's reign continued in small, measured steps, each one guided more by those who surrounded him than by the boy himself. He made no proclamations of war nor grand gestures of justice. He did not speak often of his brother, but when he did, the words came haltingly, as though he were trying to remember a dream that had long since soured. He was strong, he once said to Marjorie, his voice small and and he wanted people to listen. Marjorie, ever the queen of gentle manipulations, only nodded and squeezed his hand. She did not remind him of the screams in the throne room, nor the way Joffrey had made even shadows flinch. She knew too well the power of memory when polished by time. It could make monsters into martyrs, tyrants into tales. And Joffrey, now safely buried beneath layers of myth and stone, would become whatever the realm needed him to be. But the ones who remembered him truly, who had known the raw, ugly shape of his reign, they carried different truths. Sansa, far from the capital, whispered none of what she had witnessed, but it lived in her, etched into her like frost that never quite melts. She had learned to move silently, to speak with grace, to navigate wolves and serpents alike, but somewhere beneath all that lay the girl who had watched a boy die in agony and had felt neither guilt nor joy, only release. The girl who had once wanted fairy tales and instead had been fed to the dragons of men. Now she wore a new name, a new face, but the shadow Joffrey had cast across her life still traced every step she took. In that way he endured. Cersei's grief, once hot as wildfire, had cooled into something harder, more dangerous, vengeance. But even vengeance has limits when it turns inward. Her alliance with the Faith, the very tool she had intended to wield against the Tyrells, turned against her like a blade with no handle. The silence Joffrey left behind became her prison, not just in stone and cell, but in soul. For all her fury, all her cunning, she could not rewrite the truths she had lived. She had raised him with her own hands. She had taught him power without mercy, identity without humility. And now, in her quieter moments, beneath the layers of pride and wine, she wondered if he had ever been capable of being anything else, if he had ever truly been hers, or if she had only ever held a reflection of her own fear. Even the Iron Throne, that twisted monument to conquest and cruelty, seemed different in the wake of his death. No longer did it bear his weight, nor echo with his shrill voice declaring punishment or favor. It stood empty more often than not, a relic that loomed over all who dared enter its hall. Those who looked upon it now did so with something deeper than reverence, unease. It had tasted the blood of a child who fancied himself a god. It had heard his laughter, his shrieks, his silence, and in return it offered no comfort, only cold steel. But history has no patience for silence, only for story. And in time the stories came. Minstrels sang of the golden boy who died too soon, of the wedding with the poisoned wine, of the cruel child struck down by fate. Some made him a warning, others a tragedy. His name, once spoken in fear or fury, became just another chapter in the long, blood-stained ledger of kings. Children learned of him as they learned of Mad Ares, of Maegor the Cruel, of other rulers whose fires burned hot and brief. He became a parable. Rule not as Joffrey ruled. Love not as Cersei loved. Yet even as his name faded into history, the truth did not vanish. It lived on in the decisions made in his shadow, in the laws passed to appease a realm still shivering from his reign, in the caution with which kings now raised their sons. He had shown them what happened when power was given to fear, when a crown crowned not a man but a wound, and wounds left to fester do not heal, they spread. The final truth of Joffrey Baratheon was not that he had been cruel, nor that he had died young, but that he had mattered. Not as he had wished, to be adored, revered, immortalized, but as a lesson, etched not in marble, but in memory. A mirror held to a kingdom too long enamored with strength and blind to its cost. And so, in the end, the boy with the poisoned heart did not vanish. He lingered in the quiet between bells, in the hush before the council speaks, in the wine left untouched, in the throne left momentarily empty, in every whisper that asks, what will become of the next king? And though the wind carried away the last of his name, and the dust covered the stones where he once walked, somewhere beyond the reach of gods or men, The silence he left behind still listened, still waited, still remembered.